The order was simple, almost a formality. Reduce speed. The sea was a churning gray chaos, and naval doctrine was clear about protecting the ships. But on the bridge of his flagship, one man saw it differently. He saw the enemy ahead and the seconds ticking away. To him, the storm was not an obstacle, it was cover, and speed was not a risk, it was a weapon. This single decision, to push his destroyers faster and harder than anyone thought possible, would earn him a name whispered with a mix of awe and disbelief throughout the fleet. A name that became a legend. But what kind of person defies not just the enemy, but the very elements to gain an edge? Don't forget to like, leave a comment, and subscribe. You are not here by accident. His story begins far from any ocean, in the high, dry air of Boulder, Colorado, at the turn of the 20th century. He was born Arleigh Albert Burke, a name that would one day be welded onto the steel hulls of warships. But back then, he was the son of farmers, surrounded by the vast, silent landscapes of the American West. His family came from Sweden, immigrants who had traded the politics of the old world for the promise of the soil. There was nothing in this environment, nothing in the daily rhythm of farm life, that suggested a future commanding fleets upon the world's great waters. It raises a fundamental question. How does a boy who knows only the earth and the sky learn to master the sea? The roots of his character, perhaps, lie with his grandfather. This was a man who had been a member of the Swedish Parliament, a figure of some standing who chose to leave it all behind. He came to America and, in a move of profound symbolism, changed the family name from Björkgren to Burke. It was a clean break, a deliberate step into a new identity. One can only wonder what stories the young Arleigh heard about this grandfather, what lessons he absorbed about duty, risk, and the courage to remake oneself. It seems a certain stubborn independence ran in the family, a belief that a man's path is not set by his origins, but by his will. That will was tested early. The dream of attending the United States Naval Academy was a distant one for a boy from Colorado. There were no family connections to the Navy, no well-worn path to follow. Securing an appointment required a relentless campaign of letters, exams, and political maneuvering. He failed on his first attempt. He was not the kind of candidate the system was built to find. But persistence was his first true weapon. He eventually won a spot, arriving in Annapolis in 1919, a world away from the farm, an outsider entering one of the nation's most rigid and traditional institutions. His time at the academy was not marked by brilliance, at least not in the way one might expect. His academic record was solid, but unremarkable. He was not at the top of his class. He was not a celebrated athlete. Instead, he was known for a quiet, intense focus and an almost unnerving capacity for hard work. An early injury to his foot seemed to close the door on a more glamorous career path, forcing him to rely on his mind and his resolve. It was here, in the demanding halls of the academy, that the foundations were laid. Not for a flashy officer, but for a commander who understood the mechanics of warfare, the limits of men and machines, and the critical importance of a single, well-timed decision. Graduation from Annapolis did not thrust him into the heart of the action. The 1920s were a time of peace, and the United States Navy was a slow-moving institution, governed by tradition and seniority. His first assignment was aboard the battleship USS Arizona, a colossal city of steel where a junior officer could easily get lost in the hierarchy. Life was a cycle of drills, inspections, and formal routines. It was a world that rewarded conformity, not innovation. For a young man with a restless mind, It must have been a period of profound patience, learning a system that seemed designed to stifle the very qualities a war would demand. He soon found his niche, not on the command bridge, but deep within the ship's machinery. While other officers might have pursued the more prestigious paths of navigation or strategy, Burke was drawn to ordnance and engineering. He developed a fascination with the mechanics of naval warfare, the intricate dance of gears and hydraulics that brought the big guns to life. This was an unglamorous specialty, a world of grease, noise, and complex calculations, but it gave him an intimate understanding of a warship's capabilities and its limitations. It was a practical, hands-on education in what a ship could truly be made to do, if pushed. This focus on the mechanical heart of the Navy defined his early career. He served tours at the Naval Gun Factory in Washington, D.C., and earned a Master of Science in Chemical Engineering. He was building a different kind of foundation for command, one based not on social grace or political connection, but on an encyclopedic knowledge of the tools of his trade. He believed that battles were not won by grand theories alone, but by the superior performance of men and their machines in the critical moment. He wanted to understand every shell, every fuse, every boiler, because he knew that in a fight, a single failure in any one of them could mean the difference between life and death. His career took him far from the main battle fleet to the Asiatic station. This was a different kind of navy, a small independent force operating on the far side of the world. Here, officers were expected to be more self-reliant, to think on their feet without a massive support structure to fall back on. He commanded older, smaller ships, destroyers from the First World War era. It was on the bridges of these aging vessels that he began to hone his own philosophy of command, far from the watchful eyes of the admirals in Pearl Harbor or San Diego. The distance gave him a certain freedom to experiment, to push his crews and his ships in ways that might have been frowned upon elsewhere. The long years between the wars created a sense of stagnation in the Navy. Promotions were slow, and for many the primary goal was simply to avoid making a mistake that could end a career. But Burke seemed to see this period differently. He saw it as a time of preparation. He became known as a relentless taskmaster, a commander who drilled his crews until they could perform their duties in their sleep. He was obsessed with gunnery, constantly seeking ways to shave fractions of a second off loading times, to improve accuracy, to turn his small command into the most lethal fighting unit it could possibly be. His men may not have always enjoyed the grueling pace, but they developed a fierce pride in their abilities. There was a story that followed him from this period. While commanding a destroyer, he was informed that a critical piece of equipment was broken and that regulations required them to return to a major naval base for repairs. Such a trip would have taken weeks. Burke, however, simply asked his engineers if they could fix it themselves. They thought they could. He told them to do it, a clear violation of the rules. It was a small act of defiance, but it was telling. He valued readiness and results over rigid adherence to a bureaucracy that seemed disconnected from the realities of operating at sea. This quiet, methodical preparation for a war that was still only a distant possibility was the defining feature of his early service. He was not a firebrand. He was not a charismatic speaker. He was an engineer of naval combat, a man who believed that victory was assembled piece by piece, long before the first shot was ever fired. He was building a reputation not as a brilliant strategist, but as an officer who got things done. An officer whose ships were always ready, whose crews were always the sharpest. It was a reputation that would serve him well when the world finally descended into chaos. Then came the morning of December 7th, 1941. The news of the attack on Pearl Harbor was a seismic shock to the entire nation, but for Burke, it must have been intensely personal. The USS Arizona, his first ship, the place where his naval career began, was now at the bottom of the harbor, a tomb for over 1,000 of its crew. He had been transferred off the ship years earlier, a simple twist of fate that saved his life. One can only speculate on the impact of that news, the mix of grief, anger, and perhaps a profound sense of purpose that it must have ignited within him. The time for preparation was over. His entry into the war was not at the helm of a great carrier or battleship. The Navy, reeling from its losses, needed commanders for its most versatile and expendable ships, the destroyers. These were the greyhounds of the fleet, fast, thin-skinned, and packed with firepower. They were hunters, screeners, and scouts. Commanding a destroyer in combat, especially a division of them, required a special kind of nerve. It demanded aggression, quick thinking, and a willingness to close with the enemy, to fight in the dark at close quarters, where a single mistake could be fatal. It was a role that seemed almost tailor-made for Arleigh Burke. He was sent to the South Pacific, to the cauldron of the Solomon Islands campaign. This was not a war of grand, sweeping fleet actions. It was a brutal, grinding fight in a maze of volcanic islands and treacherous channels, a place the sailors called the Slot. Here, the war was fought at night. The Japanese Navy had mastered the art of night combat, using their superior torpedoes and well-trained crews to inflict punishing losses on the Americans. The challenge for a commander like Burke was not just to fight the enemy, but to overcome a tactical and technological disadvantage in some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. He was given command of Destroyer Squadron 23. The ships were new, their crews were green, and they were being thrown into one of the most savage theaters of the war. Burke immediately began to implement his own demanding training regimen, drilling his men relentlessly, day and night. He knew that their survival depended on being faster, smarter, and more cohesive than their opponents. He fostered a sense of identity, an elite spirit. The squadron soon earned a nickname, the Little Beavers, a nod to a comic strip character, but a name that would become synonymous with relentless, aggressive action. Burke's philosophy was simple and brutal. He believed in attacking. He believed in using speed as a weapon, not just to get into position, but to disorient the enemy and to protect his own ships. He developed tactics that were unorthodox. He would charge at the enemy at the highest possible speed, often in terrible weather, using the chaos of the sea and the darkness of the night as cover. He calculated that the risk of pushing his ships and men to their absolute limits was less than the risk of being cautious and predictable. It was a high-stakes gamble every single time they went out. His first major test came at the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay. It was a confused, chaotic night action, a swirling melee of ships firing at shadows in the dark. Burke led his division in a high-speed torpedo attack, pressing forward with an aggression that surprised the Japanese commanders. He maneuvered his ships with precision, coordinating their movements and their fire in a way that turned his squadron into a single, deadly weapon. He was not just commanding ships, he was conducting an orchestra of violence, and he was a master of its tempo. In the aftermath of these early battles, a new name for him began to circulate through the fleet. The story of the commander who defied a direct order to reduce speed in a storm, who pushed his destroyers so hard their engines were at risk of failing, became the stuff of legend. He was no longer just Captain Burke. He was 31 Knot Burke, a title born from his absolute refusal to slow down, his unshakable belief that the only way to win was to go faster, hit harder, and never, ever give the enemy a moment to think. This was not recklessness. It was a calculated and terrifying form of warfare. He understood the psychological toll of this kind of fighting. He knew his men were exhausted, living on coffee and adrenaline. But he also understood the psychology of his enemy. He reasoned that an opponent who is constantly under pressure, who is never allowed to rest or to set the terms of the engagement, is an opponent who will eventually make a mistake. His entire strategy was built around forcing that mistake, around being the relentless, inescapable presence in the darkness that the enemy came to fear. The little beavers, under his command, were rewriting the textbook on destroyer tactics. They engaged in a series of sharp, vicious night battles, fighting for control of the waters around the Solomon Islands. With each engagement, their reputation grew, as did that of their commander. He had taken a group of new ships and inexperienced sailors and forged them into one of the most effective fighting units in the Pacific. But the campaign was far from over. The greatest tests, the moments that would truly define his legacy, were still ahead, waiting for him in the dark waters of the slot. The opportunity he had been training his squadron for arrived in late November of 1943. Intelligence, painstakingly gathered and decoded, painted a clear picture. The Japanese were pulling their troops off Buka Island, a final, desperate evacuation. They would send a group of destroyers, fast and heavily armed, to act as transports and escorts. They would be running at night, using the darkness as their shield. For Burke, this was not just a target, it was an appointment. He was ordered to take his 5 destroyers and intercept them. This was the classic mission of the so-called Tokyo Express, the high-speed supply and evacuation runs that had been the lifeblood of the Japanese war effort in the Solomons. And for months, they had been remarkably successful. But this time was different. This time, the hunter knew exactly where the prey would be. Burke gathered his commanders, laying out a plan that was both audacious and meticulously detailed. He would not simply meet the enemy head-on in a chaotic gunfight. He intended to set a trap. He felt the immense pressure of the moment, the knowledge that the lives of over 1,000 men rested on his judgment. This was the culmination of all the drills, all the sleepless nights, all the relentless pushing of men and machinery. He had forged his squadron into a weapon, and now he was about to aim it. One can only speculate on the thoughts of a commander in those final hours before contact, the quiet internal calculus of risk, duty, and the haunting possibility of failure. For Burke, it seems, there was a clarity, a cold and determined focus on the task ahead. His plan was a model of tactical elegance. He divided his 5 destroyers into 2 divisions. The first, under his direct command, would make the initial contact, but it would not open fire with its guns. Instead, it would launch a full salvo of torpedoes from maximum effective range, remaining unseen, a ghost in the darkness. The second division would hold back, positioned perfectly to attack the enemy ships once they were thrown into confusion and chaos by the torpedo impacts. It was a strategy designed not just to win, but to annihilate. Everything depended on timing, on discipline, and on the still unproven mastery of radar. In the blackness of a moonless Pacific night, the radar screen was their only set of eyes. It was a flickering, uncertain window into the world beyond the bridge. The men who operated these sets were interpreting shadows, trying to distinguish between a rain squall, a nearby island, and the faint, fleeting echo of an enemy warship. The entire operation rested on their skill, on their ability to guide Burke's ships into the perfect firing position without ever being detected themselves. The long hours of the approach were a study in tension. The only sounds were the low thrum of the turbines and the quiet, professional exchange of reports between the bridge and the Combat Information Center. The ships sliced through the water at high speed, a silent gray flotilla on a mission of absolute destruction. Burke stood on his bridge, a coiled spring of energy, waiting. He had done everything he could to prepare his men. The rest was in the hands of fate and the cold physics of naval warfare. Then it came. A voice from the radar room, calm but electric. Contact. Multiple contacts, bearing 015, range 22,000 yards. The Japanese were exactly where the intelligence reports said they would be. They were steaming forward, completely unaware that they were sailing into a perfectly laid ambush. Burke gave the order to adjust course, to bring his ships into the ideal launch position. There was no excitement in his voice, only the flat, controlled tone of a man executing a complex and deadly piece of mathematics. The command was given: fire torpedoes. Deep within the hulls of the American destroyers, the deadly projectiles were ejected, hitting the water with a splash before their own motors ignited, sending them on their silent, invisible run toward the enemy line. Then, an agonizing wait. Minutes stretched into an eternity. On the bridge, no one spoke. They just watched the clock, counting the seconds, knowing that hundreds of pounds of high explosives were closing the distance in the dark. It was the purest form of naval combat, a strike delivered from miles away with no certainty of its effect until the final, violent moment. The night erupted. 2, then 3 brilliant orange flashes blossomed on the horizon, lighting up the sea for an instant. The trap had been sprung. The lead Japanese destroyer, the Onami, seemed to simply vanish in a catastrophic explosion. 2 others, the Makinami and Yugiri, were crippled, burning and slowing to a crawl. The Japanese formation, moments before a disciplined line of warships, was now a scene of chaos and fire. Their command structure was shattered. They were wounded, blind, and disoriented. Now came the second phase of Burke's plan. He gave the order that would define his legend. All ships, commence firing. He turned his division and charged directly at the heart of the enemy, his ship's 5-inch guns roaring to life, spitting streams of fire across the water. He had achieved the tactician's dream. He was crossing their T, bringing the full broadside firepower of his ships to bear on the remaining enemy vessels, which could only reply with their forward-facing guns. It was a complete and total mismatch. The battle, which would later be known as the Battle of Cape St. George, became a relentless pursuit. The American destroyers, fighting as a coordinated pack, hunted down the surviving Japanese ships. Their gunnery was precise. Their maneuvering was flawless. They had drilled for this exact scenario countless times, and in the heat of combat, their training took over. They were a seamless, efficient killing machine, guided by the single aggressive will of their commander. In the midst of the chase, as one of the burning Japanese ships slipped beneath the waves, an officer on Burke's bridge made a suggestion. There were enemy sailors in the water, visible in the light of the fires. He asked for permission to fire on them. Burke's reply was immediate and absolute. No. Cease fire. He would not target helpless men in the water. In that single, decisive command, he revealed a core of principle that existed alongside his ruthless, tactical mind. It was a moment of humanity in the middle of a maelstrom. When the sun rose, the results were stunning. 3 Japanese destroyers were at the bottom of the sea, and another was heavily damaged. The Little Beavers, destroyer Squadron 23, had not suffered a single hit. Not one American sailor had been killed or wounded. It was, by any measure, a flawless victory. It was the kind of engagement that naval officers study for generations, a perfect storm of superior intelligence, brilliant tactics, and flawless execution. The Battle of Cape St. George was more than just a successful mission. It was the final, brutal punctuation mark on the long and bloody Solomon Islands campaign. The Tokyo Express was finished, but for Arleigh Burke, it was something more personal. It was the ultimate validation of his philosophy. His belief in speed, in aggression, in relentless training, and in the absolute necessity of seizing the initiative had been proven beyond any doubt. The legend of 31-knot Burke was no longer a matter of rumor or reputation. It was now etched into the official history of the war at sea. The victory at Cape St. George was a masterpiece, a textbook example of naval warfare. But a textbook leaves out the most important details. It doesn't mention the smell of stale coffee and sweat on the bridge, the constant, bone-jarring vibration of a destroyer pushed past its limits, or the gnawing exhaustion that seeps into a man's soul after weeks of relentless combat. For Arleigh Burke and the men of Destroyer Squadron 23, the real battle wasn't just against the Japanese. It was against time, against sleep, and against the crushing weight of the war itself. They had been operating on a knife's edge for what felt like an eternity. Every night was a potential engagement. Every shadow on the radar a possible threat. Sleep came in snatched minutes, not hours. Meals were eaten standing up. The men grew thin, their eyes hollow, their nerves frayed to a wire. The Pacific itself seemed an enemy, with its sudden squalls and oppressive humidity that rusted metal and rotted morale. This was the unseen crisis, the slow-motion attrition that grinds down even the finest fighting units. Burke felt it more than anyone. The responsibility for hundreds of lives rested on his every decision, made in seconds, in the dark, with imperfect information. He drove his men hard, demanding a level of performance that bordered on the impossible. But he drove himself harder. His staff watched him, worried. They saw a man fueled by an almost inhuman will, a commander who refused to show weakness, who refused to slow down. But they wondered quietly how long any man could sustain such a pace before something broke. The ships themselves were screaming in protest. The little beavers were thoroughbreds, built for speed and aggression, but they were not invincible. Engines were pushed into the red. Hulls were strained. Delicate electronics were shaken to pieces by the constant high-speed maneuvering and the shock of their own guns. Maintenance crews worked miracles with scavenged parts and sheer ingenuity, but there was a sense that the squadron was running on borrowed time. One critical failure, one engine that quit at the wrong moment, could mean the difference between a heroic victory and a watery grave. His entire philosophy was a high-wire act. The name 31-knot Burke was a badge of honor, but it also described a doctrine of immense risk. Charging into the dark at flank speed, relying on radar that could fail and intelligence that could be wrong, was a gamble. It worked because he was brilliant, and perhaps because he was lucky. But in the back of every sailor's mind was the question, what happens when that luck runs out? One miscalculation, one unseen torpedo, and the legend would be extinguished in a fireball. The relentless pressure forged an incredible bond between the men. They were more than a crew, they were a brotherhood, united by shared danger and a fierce pride in their commander. They saw his aggression not as recklessness, but as the surest path to survival. He was taking the fight to the enemy, never waiting, never hesitating. In a war of attrition, His strategy was to make sure the other side was the one being attrited. It was a brutal, exhausting, but ultimately effective calculus. There were moments that never made it into the official reports. A Japanese plane, a washing machine Charlie, dropping a flare almost directly overhead, exposing them for what felt like an eternity while they waited for the bombs that, by some miracle, never came. Or the time a lookout spotted the faint wake of a torpedo passing just yards astern, a silent messenger of death that had somehow missed its mark. These near misses were constant reminders of their mortality, of how thin the veil was between their vibrating steel deck and the cold, dark water below. This period, this crucible in the Solomon Islands, was the true test. Cape St. George was the exclamation point, but the long, grueling sentences were written in the weeks of sleepless pursuit that preceded it. It was here that Burke's command was sharpened to a razor's edge. He was not just fighting an enemy fleet, he was fighting the fundamental limitations of men and machines. And in this desperate, exhausting struggle, he was pushing his squadron toward a level of proficiency that few in naval history have ever achieved. What emerged from this trial by fire was something more than just a successful naval unit. Destroyer Squadron 23 became a legend in its own time. They were Halsey's Little Beavers, the fire brigade that could be sent anywhere, tasked with the most dangerous missions, with the full expectation that they would not only succeed, but dominate. They had been tested in the worst conditions imaginable and had not been found wanting. This, more than any single battle, was the culmination of Burke's efforts. His reputation spread throughout the Pacific Fleet. When word went out that Burke's squadron was on the prowl, other commanders took notice. The enemy certainly did. Radio intercepts suggested the Japanese had a special dread for this particular group of destroyers that seemed to move faster, shoot straighter, and fight with a terrifying ferocity. The nickname 31-Knot Burke was no longer just a descriptor of his tactics, it was a promise of impending violence. This period of command was the ultimate expression of his naval philosophy. It was about more than just speed. It was about seizing the initiative and never letting it go. It was about training his men so relentlessly that in the chaos of a night battle, their actions were instinctive. He empowered his ship captains, trusting them to make decisions on their own, creating a flexible, adaptable fighting force that could react faster than a more rigidly controlled enemy. He had built a system designed for victory. In just a few short months, under his command, the Little Beavers fought in more than 20 separate engagements. They were credited with destroying 1 Japanese submarine, 9 destroyers, and several smaller vessels, as well as shooting down dozens of aircraft. It was a breathtaking record of destruction, a campaign of annihilation conducted with a speed and efficiency that stunned both friend and foe. He had taken a group of ships and turned them into the most lethal fighting force of its kind in the world. This wasn't just about aggression, it was about intelligence. Burke was a master of the new technologies of war, particularly radar. He saw it not just as a defensive tool for detecting threats, but as an offensive weapon, a way to see in the dark, to set up the perfect ambush, to strike an enemy who did not even know he was there. He drilled his radar teams until they could read the ghostly green blips on their screens like a book, interpreting the enemy's formation, speed, and intent from faint electronic whispers. The accolades began to pour in. Commendations from Admiral Halsey, a Navy Cross, and the respect of his peers. But the true measure of his success was in the quiet confidence of his own men. They had been through hell with him, and they had come out the other side, victorious and alive. They knew they were part of something special, a moment in history that would be studied for generations. They had seen his genius up close in the heat of battle, and they would follow him anywhere. Yet, there is a strange paradox in reaching such a peak. When you achieve a string of perfect victories, does it make you more cautious, more protective of that flawless record? Or does it embolden you to take even greater risks? For a man like Burke, who had built his entire career on calculated aggression, this was not just a tactical question. It was a deeply personal one. He had proven his methods beyond all doubt. He had reached the zenith of a destroyer commander's career. He had forged a weapon, honed it in battle, and used it to achieve one of the most lopsided victories of the entire war. He was no longer just a capable officer, he was a naval icon. But the war was vast, and his part in it was far from over. After a campaign of such intensity, after pushing men and ships to the absolute breaking point, the inevitable question arises: what do you do for an encore? The answer, it turned out, was not another perfect battle. The war did not offer encores. It offered new and more brutal problems. After his tour with the Little Beavers, a tour that had pushed ships and men to the very edge of their endurance, Burke was reassigned. He was not sent home for a rest, nor was he given another squadron to command. His success had made him too valuable to risk on the bridge of a single destroyer. He was brought onto the staff of Admiral Mark Mitcher, the commander of the legendary Fast Carrier Task Force 58. This was a different kind of war. He was no longer the tip of the spear, he was now part of the mind that guided it. From the claustrophobic flag plot of a carrier, he helped plan the massive operations that were grinding the Japanese Empire down. He was surrounded by maps and radios, not the open sea and the spray of a bow wave. For a man of action, a man who thrived on direct command and the visceral feel of a ship under his feet, this new role must have been a strange and difficult adjustment. He was watching the war through a new lens, one of immense strategic scale, but also one of frustrating distance. The price of victory in the Pacific was always paid in steel and in lives, and in this new role, Burke would witness that cost in a way he never had before. The clean, almost surgical destroyer actions of the Solomons were a thing of the past. The enemy was growing more desperate. A new and terrifying word entered the naval lexicon, a word that spoke of a fanaticism that tactics alone could not defeat. Kamikaze, the divine wind. Men who were not just willing to die, but who had made their own death the primary weapon. He was aboard Mitcher's flagship, the carrier USS Bunker Hill, in the spring of 1945, during the invasion of Okinawa. This was the epicenter of the kamikaze storm. The task force was under constant, relentless attack from the air. It was no longer a chess match of maneuver and firepower. It was a grim, bloody ordeal of survival. One morning, the Bunker Hill was struck by 2 suicide planes in the span of 30 seconds. The ship was transformed into a floating inferno. Burke was there, in the heart of the chaos. He was thrown to the deck by the force of the explosions. He was surrounded by smoke, by the roar of flames, by the terrible sounds of a great warship dying. Hundreds of men were lost in minutes. He saw the full, horrific cost of this new form of warfare up close. Yet, in the middle of this catastrophe, his training, his discipline, his entire being took over. He picked himself up and immediately began to help organize the damage control efforts, to account for the staff, to ensure that the command function of the fleet did not break down. Mitcher and his staff, including Burke, were forced to transfer their flag, first to one destroyer, then to the carrier USS Enterprise. Days later, the Enterprise too was hit by a kamikaze. The explosion was immense, destroying the forward aircraft elevator and causing catastrophic damage. Once again, Burke was at the center of the storm, a witness to the random, brutal finality of this kind of attack. He had gone from being the hunter, the relentless aggressor, to being the hunted, a target in a steel box, enduring a threat that seemed to defy all military logic. This experience must have marked him profoundly. The legend of 31-knot Burke was forged in battles where he controlled the outcome, where his speed and aggression gave him the edge. But off the coast of Okinawa, he learned a different, harsher lesson. He learned about endurance. He learned about the sheer, stubborn will to survive when the enemy's only goal is to take you with them. He learned the price of command not in terms of tactical risk, but in the unavoidable, random loss of the men you are responsible for. The physical toll on the fleet was immense, but the psychological weight was perhaps even greater. How do you fight an enemy who does not wish to survive the encounter? How do you plan for an attack that is not meant to achieve a military objective, but is simply an act of annihilation? These were the questions that Burke and the other staff officers had to grapple with every single day, under the constant threat of another attack from the sky. The war had changed him. It had taken the brilliant tactician and forced him to become a survivor. As the final convulsive months of the war played out, Burke remained with Mitchell. He was there for the final carrier strikes against the Japanese home islands. He saw the war through to its bitter conclusion, a conclusion brought about not by a final, decisive naval battle, but by a weapon of unimaginable power unleashed on two cities. The noise of the guns and the explosions was replaced by a sudden, deafening silence. He stood on the deck of a ship in Tokyo Bay during the formal surrender ceremony in September of 1945. He was a witness to the end of it all. What must have been going through his mind? The memory of the Solomons, of the night battles, of the little beavers racing through the dark. The memory of the fires on the Bunker Hill, of the smoke and the chaos. He had seen the war in all its facets, from the intimate, tactical duel of destroyers to the vast, impersonal slaughter of the late war campaigns. The end of the war was not just a victory, it was a profound caesura in his life. The man who had been defined by his relentless drive, his need for speed and action, now faced a world at peace. The skills he had honed to a razor's edge were, for the moment, no longer needed. The Great Crusade was over. The enemy was defeated. The ships would go home, and the men would try to piece their lives back together. But for Arleigh Burke, the war was never truly over. It lived inside him. The lessons he had learned in the South Pacific, about technology, about training, about the absolute necessity of seizing the initiative, would become the foundation for the rest of his career. He had seen what it took to win, but he had also seen, in the most visceral way imaginable, the terrible cost of being unprepared. The nickname 31-knot Burke would follow him for the rest of his life. It had been earned in the heat of battle, a testament to his aggressive spirit. But in the long years of peace that followed, it came to mean something else. It became a symbol of a different kind of urgency, a relentless drive to innovate, to prepare, to ensure that the Navy he would one day lead would never again have to pay such a high price in blood. The war had taken a promising officer and forged him into a legend. It had tested him with fire and exhaustion and the constant presence of death. He had not only survived, he had prevailed. But the victory was not without its scars. The memories of the men who did not come home, of the ships that now lay on the bottom of the Pacific, were a burden he would carry forever. He left the Second World War as one of its most celebrated naval heroes. But the quiet man who watched the Japanese delegation sign the surrender documents was a different person from the one who had first sailed into the Pacific. He had learned that the greatest victories are often the ones that are the most costly, and that the true measure of a commander is not just how he fights, but how he endures. The war was over, but the work of Arleigh Burke was just beginning. The man who demanded 31 knots from his destroyers was, in person, remarkably quiet. He was not a blustery, loud commander. Those who served with him described a man of intense focus, a man whose mind was always working, always calculating. His aggression was a professional tool, honed and directed with incredible precision. It was not the product of a hot temper, but of a cold, clear understanding of naval combat. He believed that hesitation was fatal, that the side that struck first and fastest usually won. But this belief was built on a foundation of endless, painstaking preparation. His defining characteristic, perhaps even more than his speed, was a profound and unwavering loyalty. It was a loyalty that flowed in both directions. His men in the Little Beavers would have followed him anywhere, because they knew he had thought through every possibility to keep them safe. And his loyalty upwards, to his commanders, was absolute. The most telling example came in the hellish aftermath of the kamikaze attacks on the carrier Bunker Hill. His commander, Admiral Mark Mitcher, was shaken, his staff decimated. Burke was offered his own command, a promotion he had earned 10 times over. He refused. He believed his duty was to stay with his admiral, to help him rebuild, to see him through the crisis. It was a decision that revealed everything about his character. Honor and duty were not abstract concepts to him. They were the very framework of his existence. He was a man driven by a relentless work ethic that bordered on the superhuman. Sleep was a luxury he rarely afforded himself or his staff. He believed that victory was found in the margins, in the extra hour of planning, the extra drill, the exhaustive study of charts and intelligence reports. This wasn't ambition in the traditional sense. It wasn't about personal glory. It was about responsibility. He felt the weight of every life under his command, and he was determined to leave nothing to chance that could be controlled by effort. He drove his people hard, but he drove himself harder. He led from the front, not just in battle, but in the grueling, endless work of preparation. For all his achievements, there was a core of humility to him. He was quick to credit his subordinates for their successes, often deflecting praise directed at him. He understood that a commander was nothing without a well-trained, motivated crew. He listened to his junior officers, valued their input. He saw the Navy not as a ladder to be climbed, but as a complex organism where every part had a vital role to play. This respect for the chain of command, from the lowest seaman to the highest admiral, was part of his genius. He knew how to command, but he also knew how to serve. He was a warrior, but he was also a scholar of his profession. He read history. He studied technology. He thought deeply about the future of naval warfare. He was not simply executing orders, he was constantly thinking about how to do things better, faster, more effectively. He saw the patterns in the chaos, the opportunities that others missed. And beneath the steely exterior of the tactician, there was a man who felt the losses acutely. He was not immune to the cost of war. He carried the names and faces of the men who did not return with him. This internal tension between the cold logic of command and the deep empathy for his men is perhaps the key to understanding the real Arleigh Burke. He was a man who had mastered the art of war, but never lost sight of its terrible human price. The legend of 31-knot Burke is so clean, so perfect, that one has to wonder about its creation. The story of him demanding more speed from a damaged destroyer is iconic. But was it truly a single, spontaneous moment? Or was it the culmination of a reputation he had carefully cultivated? Some who knew him suggested that the nickname was as much a piece of psychological warfare as it was a literal command. It was a signal to the enemy and to his own men that he would not be outrun, that he would always be on the offense. The name itself became a weapon, a declaration of intent that preceded him into every battle. The truth of its origin may be lost to time, but its effect is undeniable. In the tight-knit, fiercely competitive world of the United States Navy's officer corps, a rapid ascent like Burke's inevitably creates friction. While his successes were celebrated, it's not hard to imagine the whispers and the professional jealousies that followed him. Did other commanders, perhaps more cautious by nature, view his aggressive tactics as reckless? Was there resentment from officers who had been waiting longer for the kind of high-profile commands that Burke seemed to attract? The historical record is largely silent on these personal rivalries, focusing on the battles and victories. But human nature suggests that behind the unified front of the war effort, there were complex relationships, quiet tensions, and debates over whose philosophy of command would prevail. Then there is the unquantifiable element of luck. Burke's squadron, Destroyer Squadron 23, seemed to lead a charmed life in the Solomons. They dodged torpedoes that should have hit. They found enemy fleets in the dark when they should have been invisible. They survived encounters that should have been their end. His men called it Burke's luck. But was it truly luck, or was it the product of his obsessive training and preparation? He drilled his crews in night fighting until it was second nature. He used radar more effectively than almost anyone. He made his own luck. Still, the question lingers. In the chaotic lottery of naval combat, how many times did sheer, blind chance intervene to save him and his men, allowing the legend to grow? His post-war career raises even more intriguing questions. His leap to the very top, becoming Chief of Naval Operations, was astonishingly fast. He was a master sailor, but was he also a master of navigating the treacherous political currents of Washington? During the infamous Revolt of the Admirals in 1949, when the Navy fought for its relevance against the rise of the Air Force, Burke played a complex and subtle game. He prepared devastating testimony defending the Navy's position, yet he managed to do so without permanently alienating the political leadership. Some saw it as a sign of his unwavering integrity. Others have speculated that it was a calculated performance by a man who understood power far better than his simple, straight-talking persona let on. Ultimately, the enduring power of his story may lie in how perfectly he seemed to embody a certain ideal. He was the thinking man's warrior, a commander who combined raw aggression with deep intellect and a powerful sense of moral responsibility. He became a symbol of the modern Navy, a service defined by technological superiority and relentless initiative. But how much of that symbol is the man, and how much is the myth that grew around him? The line between the two has blurred over time, creating a figure who is perhaps more powerful as a legend than he ever was as a man. The search for the real Arleigh Burke continues, hidden somewhere in the smoke of battle and the quiet corridors of power. The innovations Burke brought to the fight in the Solomon Islands were not just personal flourishes. They represented a fundamental shift in how the United States Navy viewed its destroyers. Before him, these ships were largely seen as escorts, a protective screen for the precious aircraft carriers and battleships. Burke saw something different. He saw a pack of wolves. He unleashed his Destroyer Squadron 23, the Little Beavers as an independent offensive force, a team of stalkers designed to hunt at night. This transformation of doctrine, from defensive shield to offensive spearhead, rippled through the Pacific Fleet. Was this a revolution born of necessity and the desperate night battles around Guadalcanal? Or was it the vision of one man who saw the untapped potential in the ships and crews he commanded? His influence extended far beyond the end of the Second World War, shaping the very structure of the Navy during the iciest decades of the Cold War. As Chief of Naval Operations, he presided over a technological leap as profound as the transition from sail to steam. The man who had perfected gunnery and torpedo tactics in the dark waters of the Pacific now championed the development of nuclear-powered submarines and ballistic missiles. He was a key architect of the Polaris program, placing a significant portion of America's nuclear deterrent beneath the waves, hidden and invulnerable. One has to wonder how a commander forged in the visceral, close-quarters combat of surface warfare reconciled himself to the abstract, world-altering calculus of nuclear strategy. His decisions in the 1950s set the course for sea power for the next half-century. Today, his name sails the world's oceans, etched onto the hulls of the most powerful surface combatants ever built. The Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer is not just a namesake, it is, in many ways, the physical embodiment of his philosophy. These ships are designed for speed, aggression, and survivability. They are built to fight and win on their own, bristling with advanced radar and missile systems that allow them to dominate the sea, the air, and even space. When the Navy chose to name this cornerstone of its modern fleet after him, was it merely an honor, or was it a deliberate statement of intent? A declaration that the spirit of 31-knot Burke drive to push the envelope, to embrace technology, and to always be on the attack was the permanent guiding principle of the service. Beyond the steel ships and the strategic doctrines, there is a more subtle, more human legacy. It exists in the culture of naval leadership. Burke's method of command, which emphasized trust in his subordinates, clear communication, and a deep personal responsibility for the welfare of his sailors, became a touchstone for generations of officers. He was known for his directness, his lack of pretense, and his belief that the men on the deck were the Navy's most valuable asset. In an era of increasing automation and remote warfare, where decisions can be made thousands of miles from the fight, his example poses a lingering question. Is the idea of the commander who knows his crew, who shares their risks, and who leads from the front a timeless ideal, or is it a romantic notion from a war that is fading from living memory?